America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone. Hi, and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters. I'm Elaine Parker, the president of the Job Creators Network Foundation.
And I'm Toni Angelini, Senior Vice President of Operations and Advocacy.
You can subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcast from. Today, I am thrilled that we're joined by David McGarry. David is a policy analyst at the Taxpayers Protection Alliance. He's written extensively on a wide range of topics related to technology, government accountability, and consumer choice. He's reported on tech policy and telecommunications, particularly at the Federal Communications Commission and on Capitol Hill. David joins us today to discuss his latest op-ed in Town Hall, which talks about the Kamala Harris's economic plan will be a disaster for consumers. David, thanks so much for joining us. I loved your op-ed.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, right off the top, it's just been reported. You may not have even seen the final number. They've been talking about it for about the last 24 hours. But the government just did one of the biggest revisions probably that we've ever seen and revised our jobs down by 818,000 jobs this year. Just poof, went away, which really just takes away the fairy tale that the Biden administration has been talking about in the jobs numbers and what they've created this year. I mean, I'm just going to give you a really easy question now that we have this number to deal with and teeing off your op-ed as well. What happens if the Democrats win and we have more policies like we're dealing with for the last 3.5 years out of the Biden-Harris administration? How are consumers and everyday ordinary Americans going to fare?
The kinds of people who are absolutely determined to regulate and to centrally plan the economy to death are going to continue to get the same results that they've been getting, I would say, for the last few years. But really, it's for the last few decades, for the last few centuries, for the last few millennia. Central planning doesn't work. Government regulation, hyper-regulation doesn't work. It squashes people's ability just to go out there and to make a living, to make the most of themselves, to take advantage of the opportunities that they discover and that they create for themselves. And so if we get another 4 years of administration that is hell-bent on regulating prolifically all the time in every sector of the economy, we're going to continue to see bad economic outcomes ensue.
I mean, just broadly speaking, we do get sort of dribs and drabs from the Harris campaign about her economic policy and what she now supports. And we've heard that she supports a capital gains tax increase on unrealized capital gains. We heard from her, and what you wrote extensively about in your op-ed is the price controls. Let me just read you my favorite line out of your op-ed. Fighting inflation with price controls resembles fighting fire with lighter fluid. Explain to our audience why price controls just doesn't work.
Price controls are a very old idea. They go back to the Code of Hammurabi and even before that. Essentially, price controls take they take a good or a service and they create scarcity. Whatever the controlled good is, price controls increase demand for it and they lower the supply. And neither of those things are what you want if you are looking for affordable and abundant amounts of, again, whatever the price controlled good or service is. Essentially, if you go to the grocery store and you see that meat has become more expensive by 50%, you'll either buy less meat or you'll find an alternative. And then you will make all sorts of personal financial decisions based on the price that you see, based on the information that is in the price that you see. And you are more likely to buy, as I said, buy less of something. There's a sort of rationing where only the people who really want the thing, in this case meat or groceries or whatnot, only the people who really want it are going to pay that higher price. And that's important because it sort of allows people to judge for themselves and to limit the amount that they consume. And then on the other side, when you see higher prices, from a producer's perspective, you have an incentive to go out and to make more of that thing. Or if you're in another industry completely, you have an incentive to enter into the industry. And this is just how markets work, right? High prices convey information, low prices convey information. What price controls really do is they take this complex economic phenomenon and they try to paper over it. They try to ignore all of the actual dynamics going on in the economy, and with some really simplistic straight line A to B thinking, say, if we just don't call a duck, it won't be a duck anymore. But of course, all of the underlying economic factors are still at work. They're still at play. All of the economic problems are still very much real, and they're very much affecting people's lives. And price controls, again, it's just sort of a way of papering over that. It's just a way of concealing that, and it never works out.
The Harris campaign is essentially using corporate greed as the reason that these price controls need to be implemented. And it's amazing how, her campaign, many Democratic candidates, they love to talk about corporate greed, and they love to implement public policy that they claim is going to, somehow prevent, additional profits for corporations. But almost universally, there is a trickle down impact on small business owners who ultimately do get caught up in these same types of regulations. What's the argument to the Harris campaign against using corporate greed as the backbone of these public policies?
Yeah, corporate greed is a really funny thing. It only pops up conveniently when politicians need it to. Always trust the government to come in and to try to solve a problem well after the problem has resolved itself. If you actually look at grocery store prices, they have not gone up in the last over a year at this point. The corporate greed thing, it was alluded to earlier that Kamala hasn't fully outlined an economic program. She's been light on the policy, right? The corporate greed is that talking point is a symptom of this larger phenomenon. We've gone to Bidenomics to Vibenomics. It's just about making the voters feel a certain way about certain policy issues. And frankly, it works, right? Because if you go to a voter and you say, that's a greedy corporation, I'm a good politician, and I'm going to do something, I'm going to do anything just to help you out, voters tend to like that. They want to feel as if political leaders are thinking about them, are thinking about the issues that affect their lives. But again, it's not true, right? This extends to a whole host of other economic issues. There's actually some really interesting literature about protectionism as well, where we found that during the Trump administration, the tariffs didn't actually bring back jobs in the way that in the way that was promised, right? Tariffs actually had a negative impact on employment in the United States, but because because politicians were able to sell this as them caring about the real issues that truly do affect Americans and doing something to solve them, they end up being able to maybe not net jobs, but they're able to net votes. And that's the incentive that keeps driving the talking points.
Well, they're certainly hammering it home to anybody that's been paying attention. You referenced grocery stores and pricing. Talk to us about Harris's position, her antitrust proposals, and what are the risks of blocking mergers like the one that you referenced in your op-ed that involves Kroger's?
Yeah, so mergers and acquisitions are a very important part of an economy, right? There's all sorts of reasons why a business might want to be acquired or to acquire another business. Essentially, the Kroger-Albertsons merger, which is the instance that I wrote about, it has a lot of potential to bring down costs for consumers. When two companies merge, oftentimes they can eliminate inefficiencies. And they can figure out ways of essentially providing the same services, but together without any of the friction that you get, that you would see pre-merger, and that just results in lower consumer prices. And in a political climate in which inflation is, I should say, the effects of inflation are such a big issue, and where Americans are still feeling the pressure on in the grocery store. whatever policymakers can do to alleviate that tension is one question, but they certainly shouldn't be taking steps that prevent the market from bringing prices down and serving customers better.
What we keep seeing is this populism message, the vibes, and things like that. And I know that voters, Americans in general, have been hurting for the last 3.5 years. I mean, when you go to the grocery store, you walk out with 3 bags and you've spent $150. My daughter lives on her own now, going to college, and she's on a fixed budget. And so she goes to the grocery store and fully understands. It's interesting to hear someone who suddenly has their own budget to manage, how they learn and understand what those price increases mean. Now, she may not be earning a salary, but she's living on a fixed budget. And so she has to figure out, I only have a finite amount of money every week to spend. When you hear all these populist messages coming out of the Harris campaign and sort of separating her message from the current administration's policies and results, there's dangers there, of course, but do you think that the American people have a different point of view? Do you think they're seeing through it, or do you think that it's resonating?
I think it's whenever we're talking about economics and the sort of your average voter's perspective, and honestly, that might not even be quite right, because perhaps a better way to view the average American is to look at the American who doesn't actually vote in elections. Maybe that's a better way to look at these things. But they're sort of, in my estimation, the average everyday Main Streeter has some very, very good instincts about policy and economics, and then sort of lacks the context and lacks the deep, sophisticated knowledge to play all of those good instincts out. And oftentimes they will sort of believe one thing, but then also think that we should make exceptions. There was some really interesting polling recently that came out that showed that Americans think that U.S. businesses should be able to compete in a free market globally. They should learn to carry their own weight and be competitive, but also large numbers of the respondents thought that we should subsidize various U.S. industries. So there's a little bit of tension there. And I don't even mean that as a criticism, right? The sainted Calvin Coolidge famously said that the chief business of America is business, right? And that's true. Americans are busy about their lives. They're doing what they should be. They're taking care of their families. They're making money. They're providing goods and services to their neighbors and to their communities. That's what they're supposed to be doing. And for the wonks and the weirdos like us who spend our days in offices reading all of this stuff, I think we just have to start communicating both to voters, to the general public, and also to politicians to try to point them in the right ways, try to get them on the right track a little bit more than they otherwise would be.
My concern, and I guess the sort of the pretext of that question is, last Friday when we heard about the plan for price controls and the idea that this is all about price gouging, what it made me think about was the price controls that we saw in the Inflation Reduction Act on pharmaceuticals, and how well received that's been, and the idea that there's a belief that the pharmaceuticals are price gouging patients in an effort to just earn record profits. And I know there's sort of a lack of understanding at the billions of dollars that go into the R&D, the number of drugs that fail, and that the money was invested, and that the very few that make it to the end, they've got to recoup that to continue the R&D. And I think a lot of consumers don't sort of know that sausage making, but they're okay. Many people are okay with price controls on pharmaceuticals and don't seem to apply the same free market principles as they absolutely instinctively, reflexively. I mean, the New York Times, the Washington Post, like it was completely panned, reflexively understood that with food and groceries.
I think the pharmaceutical industry is difficult because of how highly regulated it is. There's no free market at work in the healthcare sector in the traditional sense of the word. But that actually gets at a really important point, right? Which is that when you have markets that are not actually allowed to function, it creates much more of an incentive and much more of a tendency in voters to view more government regulation as beneficial. They sort of see the game is already rigged, and so okay, now let's just get the government to do the next step to fix things further, and then obviously you continue down that road. For groceries, though, I do think it's a little bit different, right? I think people understand that if Kroger and Albertsons merge and they take up the horror, 12% of the market in a very competitive market where you have even new players like Amazon coming in and getting involved and forcing the existing incumbents to innovate. People know that their grocery store isn't a monopoly in most cases, and they know that this isn't something that they are in danger of finding themselves subjected to. And so on the one hand, I do think it's important to express the proper level of distaste whenever politicians like Harris come out and say and sort of announce these silly proposals. On the other hand, to the point about the politics that are at play rather than the economics, Harris is never going to pass this bill. This is simply not going to get through Congress. She cannot do it, and at least for now, she hasn't started threatening to do a lot of this stuff unilaterally. She wants to empower the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, to execute this. I like to think of FTC commissioners going up and down the stores at a Kroger. That bread's too expensive. Obviously, this is an unworkable, quasi unserious proposal. It's not going to get through Congress, and whatever votes it does end up picking up for Harris in this election, it doesn't actually have the political juice to become a policy manifest.
I know that's a point to be made, and for those of us who understand sausage making in DC, we know that it won't go anywhere. I mean, there's just no way that it would pass, and I understand that part of it, but the American people may not, and so I think it's important to continue trying to educate them on that point. So thanks for that.
I just want to stick with the price control themes for another couple of minutes. And, I totally understand your point of it not going anywhere. Let's all hope that remains the case. But this has been attempted before, in other places, Rome, Soviet Union, attempted by Franklin Roosevelt here at home. What do we know historically has happened in the past when this has been implemented?
Nothing good. As Richard Nixon found out painfully, price controls create shortages, they create scarcity, and they take an economic fire and they pour lighter fluid on it. Nixon, I think, is a particularly illustrative example because he knew better. He knew that he shouldn't actually go down this path. Yet, because of the political pressures, he did. He caved. He thought he had to be seen as acting. He thought he had to be seen as a president who was trying something, and then he paid the price for it. And the country paid the price for it. And as you said, this transcends time and place. This goes back to Rome, obviously, famously, the Soviets like this sort of thing. Nixon, FDR famously, killed however many hundreds of thousands or millions of pigs in order to artificially boost the price of meat. It's just a symptom of straight line A to B thinking, of sort of the idea that says if I don't like X, I should pass a law that says not X, and then X will disappear. But that's not how economics works. You can't simply say we're going to make that price go lower and we're going to give everybody $25,000 to buy a new home. And then all of the problems in the economy will fix themselves with no negative externalities or any other unforeseen consequences. And unfortunately, it just isn't true. What it just comes down to is that is not how people work. That's not how human action works. And the economics just do not pan out time and time again.
My favorite part of her speech when she announced all of this was talking about price controls, talking about giving first-time homebuyers $25,000, and then she said she was also going to reduce the deficit, and it's incredible to listen to it. I guess ignorance really is bliss, because I'm screaming at the television, like, how does that work? So let's say, David, we give you a magic wand, and we tell you that you get to, write the future policy for our country, what economic analysis would you want to use to sort of as the starting point for how to move forward?
Well, if nominated, I will not run, and if elected, I will not serve. But if I do find myself with the magic wand, I mean, I think a lot of solid economic planning, if I can use that phrase, and I'm just making sure that no one takes a shot at me for that one. But no, but the correct way to do economic planning is to get the government out of the way, right? Fundamentally, it comes down to cutting red tape. It comes down to peeling back all of the terrible, awful, rancid layers of the onion that stop your average everyday American from doing the very best that they can and really creating value for themselves, for their families, and for the people around them. This is what made America what makes America currently today so prosperous. It's just people going out there and acting in their own self-interest and trying to make a buck. And the beauty of markets is that the way that you make a dollar is by doing something for somebody else. And the more government gets involved, the more instances you see where the government is forcing you to give someone else a dollar, not for providing a good or a service, but just because of who they are. And I also, as you brought up the deficit, as someone who works for an organization that does a lot of fiscal issues, the deficit will not go away with everyone continuing to get all of the goodies that they want, all the pork that they want, right? You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't have your spending and also magically reduce the deficit. We're in a fiscal situation at this point that we need to make real cuts. We need to examine Social Security and Medicare and make real reform. And that is not going to be comfy. That is not necessarily going to be the kind of thing that gets people elected. But unfortunately, the alternative is a cliff, and we are just hurtling right to it. And I'm pretty worried that we're not going to realize what's going on until we look down.
Well, David, you mentioned your organization, the Taxpayers Protection Alliance. Tell us what you do there and what the mission of the alliance is.
We are a taxpayer and consumer watchdog. We spend a lot of time looking at the kinds of issues that make Americans' lives harder on a daily basis. Needless regulation. We obviously work a fair amount on tax issues, fiscal issues. Where's the government spending your money for no good reason? Where's the government spending your money to do things that it shouldn't be doing in the first place? And so we work on a whole host of things. I write a lot about economic issues. There's a lot that I do in antitrust, in technology, energy policy, trade policy. And when they let me out of my cage, I can have some fun and do some constitutional law every now and then. But we are looking for, as I said, we're looking for the ways that the government is misspending taxpayer dollars, that the government is working in unaccountable ways and making the lives of the average American harder, curtailing the liberties that the average American enjoys. And we fight back against that.
Well, I would suspect that you have a never-ending list of things that you can tackle on that list of things that your organization fights back on. Where can people go to take a look at what you're working on, and how can they support your organization?
Yeah, you can find us on social media. You can go to our website, protectingtaxpayers.org. You can find me personally on the platform formerly known as Twitter, still known as Twitter. What am I talking about? My handle is @David B. McGarry. And look out for our op-eds. You can sign up for our email lists. We respond in real time to a whole wide range of issues, both at the federal and at the state level. To educate people, to do what we were talking about, to hopefully help the average American understand what's actually going on, and how we can make the country better and the economy freer and more prosperous.
Well, we certainly appreciate what you're doing. David McGarry, the name of the op-ed is How Kamala Harris's Economic Plan Will Be a Disaster for Consumers. You can read it at Town Hall. David, thanks so much for joining us today on Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. And thank you all so much for joining us. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. You can subscribe to the show at SalemPodcastNetwork.com. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. Please check back and we'll have a new episode for you soon.